So we continue on with our learning to follow Jesus, our servant king, which is the Gospel of Mark. Today's sermon will be Desperate Faith. Scripture reference is Mark 5:21 through 43 and Acts 4:12. I read a story about a little girl named Tess. She went to her bedroom one day and pulled her glass jelly jar bank from its hiding place in the closet. She poured out all the change on the floor and counted it carefully. After placing the coins back in the jar and twisting on the cap, she slipped out the back door and made her way down to the drugstore down the street. The druggist waited patiently for the pharmacist to give his attention to her, but he was too busy talking to a well-dressed man. Tess made a scuffling noise with her feet, but the pharmacist didn't acknowledge her. Tess loudly cleared her throat, but still no response. Finally, she took a quarter from her jar and banged it on the glass counter, and that did it. "What do you want?" the pharmacist asked in an annoyed tone of voice. "Can't you see I'm talking to my brother from Chicago, whom I haven't seen in ages?" Young Tess answered back with the same annoyed tone. "Well, I want to talk to you about my brother. He's really sick, and I want to buy a miracle." "I beg your pardon," said the pharmacist. Tess continued, "My brother has something bad growing inside his head, and my daddy says only a miracle can save him now. So how much does a miracle cost?" Softening his a little bit, the pharmacist said, "We don't sell miracles here. Little girl, I'm sorry, but I can't help you." Tess replied, "Listen, I really need a miracle and I have money to pay for it. If it isn't enough, I will get more. Just tell me how much it costs." The well-dressed man, who was the pharmacist's brother, stooped down and asked the little girl, "What kind of miracle does your brother need?" Tess replied with her eyes welling up with tears, "Mommy says he needs an operation, but my daddy can't pay for it, so I wanted to use my money." "How much money do you have?" asked the well-dressed man from Chicago. $1.11. Tess answered barely audibly. "Well, what a coincidence," smiled the well-dressed man. $1.11 is the exact price of a miracle for little brothers. He took Tess's jars of coins and said, "Please take me to where you live. I want to see your brother and meet your parents. Let's see if I have that kind of miracle you need." The well-dressed man was Dr. Carlton Armstrong, a neurosurgeon, and to make a long story short, Dr. Armstrong was able to do the operation without charge, and it wasn't long until Tess's brother was home again and doing well. One day, as the family was happily talking about the chain of events that led them to this place of health and harmony, Tess's mom said, "That surgery was a real miracle. I wonder how much it would have cost." Tess smiled. "It cost $1.11, plus the faith of a little child." Now, I don't know if that story is true or not, but I know that desperation and hope for a miracle are powerful and can lead to demonstrations of faith. Vance Havner said, "Holy desperation is the door to God's greatest blessings. Those who proved him best in the scriptures were at the end of everything." That is certainly the case in the two stories of the two people we'll explore in today's section of it from the Gospel of Mark. Both people had come to the end of everything, and their desperate faith led them to Jesus. Today we'll complete this section that Mark that focuses on the miracles of Jesus that help us to understand who Jesus is and what Jesus can do. Jesus is the God in the flesh, and the miracle of this section show his power over nature, over large demonic presence. In today's section, we'll see that Jesus heals someone with long-term illness that had baffled doctors, and we'll see him defeat our greatest enemy, death. Who is Jesus? He is the God who can overcome the dangers of the deep, the dangers of demons and disease, and of danger of death. But beyond Jesus' incomparable power, we also see his mercy, his gentleness, and love. Both Jesus' greatness and his goodness are on display side by side in these two great miracles. Let's explore today's section like it's a play with 3 acts. Act number 1, a desperate father's plea. Mark wrote in Mark 5:21 through 24, when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live." So Jesus went with the man and a large crowd and was following and was pressing against him. Again, Mark 5:21 through 24. Mark reports to us that Jesus returned to the western side of the Sea of Galilee, and the crowds he had previously left there gathered again when he returned. In fact, Luke describes it this way in Luke 8:40. When Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. What a contrast. On the east side of the lake, the people would ask Jesus to leave. But on the west side of the lake, they greet Jesus and welcome him. Mark then introduces a man named, maybe Jairus, I don't know, who is a synagogue leader, which means that he's an important and respected man in this Jewish community. It must have been difficult, though, for him to come to Jesus for help. By this time, Jesus' ministry and many of the Pharisees had stood in opposition to him. But if Jairus had any prejudice towards Jesus, they were overshadowed by the need of his child. Jairus' little daughter was dying, and he'd certainly heard about Jesus' power to heal and had witnessed it himself. Luke tells us in Luke 8:41 and 42, just then a man named Jairus, Jairus came. He was a leader of the synagogue, and he fell at Jesus' feet and pleaded with him to come to his house because he had an only daughter about 12 years old, and she was dying. Mark automatically describes Jairus' humility and desperation. He came and fell at his feet. He begged him earnestly. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt helpless and desperate? And so you humbly threw yourself down before the Lord? If you haven't, then you will someday. We must not miss the faith that Jairus expressed in Jesus' power. He believed that if Jesus came and placed his hands on his daughter, that she would get well and live. Can you imagine the relief and joy that Jairus must have felt when Jesus agreed to go with him? Jesus could easily have denied his request, especially with the crowd around him and perhaps with many other requests that were being made of Jesus. Jairus must have known that what a long shot it was when he went to find Jesus. What were the chances that he would even be able to get close enough to Jesus to make the request? What are the chances that Jesus would say yes? Once Jesus had agreed, though, to go with him, Jairus must have felt and done everything he could to hurry Jesus along. Can you picture Jesus clearing a path, or Jairus clearing a path for Jesus through the crowd and pulling Jesus through? Act number 2, a desperate woman's touch. Mark wrote in Mark 5:25 through 29, now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything that she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. For she said, if I just touch his clothes, I will be made well. Instantly her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Again, Mark 5:25 through 29. Doesn't your heart go out to this woman? The women in our church can probably identify with her for far better than any of us men can, because you women have suffered in just the regular monthly period that you experience. But it's hard to imagine her enduring this constant flow of blood for 12 years. 12 years. Imagine how frustrating it must have been to her to have spent all of her money on doctors without it leading to a cure. She lived in our day, she would have brought the malpractice lawsuit. And incidentally, I'm glad Morgan & Morgan's around. They'd have certainly been glad to help her. But incidentally, when Luke, the doctor, wrote about that in his gospel, he didn't mention the failure of the medical establishment. I guess doctors always have each other's backs, you know. The Jewish faith, the Talmud, offered no fewer than 11 cures for the problem that afflicted this woman. Some were tonics, while others were mere superstition, such as carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen rag in the summer and a cotton rag in the winter. Undoubtedly, this woman had tried everything to remedy her situation, and now financially drained and emotionally exhausted, she suffered both the physical discomfort and the social humiliation caused by years of this sickness. Her affliction made her ceremonially unclean, which excluded her from Israel's religious life and isolated her from normal social interactions. What a horror it must have been. This woman was beyond human help. She was helpless and hopeless until she realized her last hope, Jesus. Jesus' reputation as a healer had spread throughout Galilee and had reached this woman. And just like Jairus, the woman was compelled to go to Jesus by the desperation of her need and the strength of her faith. Imagine a faith that believed that all she had to do was touch Jesus' clothes. Just touch the edge of his cloak. She would be healed. She believed Jesus had enough power and it would flow out of him without his permission. Her faith in Jesus immediately paid off, for the second her finger touched his clothing, she was instantly healed. Can you imagine the joy she felt the second she knew she was healed? She had hoped that she could be healed without Jesus even noticing her, but she was wrong about that one. Mark tells us in Mark 5:30 through 34, immediately Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." Now we can understand the reaction of the disciples to Jesus' seemingly ridiculous question, "Who touched me, my clothes?" I would have responded, "You got to be kidding. Who touched you? Everyone is touching you, Jesus. Come on." Jesus was making his way through the crowd trying to get to Jairus' house, and people were everywhere, and Jesus was brushing against people every step. Come on, Jesus, everybody's touching you. You got to be kidding. But Jesus could tell the difference between the touch of faith and the brush of fate. Jesus stopped the parade and demanded the person come forward, not only for her sake, but for the sake of others. Jesus wanted her to know that her faith was rightly placed and therefore rewarded. And Jesus wanted the crowd to know that her healing had come through faith in him. The woman wanted to hide and to escape, but Jesus, speaking directly to her, she was compelled to come forward and admit what she had done. So, she came with fear and trembling and fell down before Jesus and told the truth. I'm sure she expected to be chastised and feared that Jesus might reverse her healing. How relieved she must have been when Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." Wow. Don't you just love how tenderly Jesus spoke to her? This is the only passage in the entire New Testament where Jesus ever used the word daughter. It's a familiar term of affection and acceptance. We notice that Jesus praised her for her faith and sent her off restored. Physically and socially. Jesus didn't say that her touch made her well, or touching his garments made her well. There's no magical power in Jesus' robe or some mysterious force in him. Jesus wanted her to know that her healing came because of God's gracious response to her faith. It isn't faith in faith that makes the difference. It's faith in God that makes the difference. Surely everyone who is happy with this interpretation and the healing of this woman. Right? Wrong. I'm sure that Jairus was frustrated by the interruption. Jesus had agreed to go and heal his daughter, and he knew there was no time to lose. And what this woman did interfered with Jairus' life-saving plans for his daughter. But the text doesn't mention that he said anything about it. When Jesus stopped and started looking for the person who touched him, if it were Jairus, I would have been tempted to say, "Don't worry about it, Jesus. Let's just keep moving. Remember, my daughter's dying here. Don't forget the important stuff, Jesus." Well, now we come to Act 3. A desperate man maintains his hope. Mark writes in verse 5, 35, 36, "While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, 'Your daughter's dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?' When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, 'Don't be afraid, only believe.'" We don't know how long Jesus' interaction with the woman took, but it was long enough that while he was speaking to the woman, messengers from Jairus' house report that his daughter was dead. And there was no reason to bother the teacher anymore. It's all over. Forget about it. How can you imagine Jairus' heart must have sunk at that news? He had been so desperate. And then was so hopeful when Jesus agreed to come and heal his daughter. Now the interruption and the delay turned deadly. Jairus had believed that Jesus had the power to heal his daughter while she was still alive. The people from Jairus' house wrongly assumed that Jesus' power could do nothing once death had arrived, and therefore no reason to waste his time. How ironic that the delay to restore one's daughter had resulted in the death of another daughter. But this tragedy wasn't outside of God's sovereign purpose, and the delay resulted in even a greater miracle, much like the delay in case of Lazarus resulted in a greater miracle. When Jesus heard what the messengers had told Jairus, Jesus countered with their conclusion with a very difficult command. "Don't be afraid, only believe." We can imagine Jairus' thoughts spinning in his brain. What do you mean, don't be afraid? Only believe. Believe what? Believe that they're wrong and my daughter isn't dead? According to Luke, Jesus added the promise, she will be made well. The experience of most everyone in the history of humanity is the reality that physically dead people don't come back to life physically. Right? Well, that wasn't exactly what Jesus was encouraging Jairus to believe. I don't know how much further they had to go to get to Jairus' house, but I'm sure along the way he struggled to believe that his dead daughter would come back to life. Yet his only hope was that Jesus could make a difference. Surely no one else could. So Mark concluded the story in Mark 5:37 through 43. He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother. And they came to the leader's house, and they saw a commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, and then he put them all aside. He took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and entered the place where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand and said, "Talitha koum," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this time they were utterly astonished, and then he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Jewish customs around death and mourning were quite clear and extensive. The professional mourners had already arrived and were in full swing. Jesus announced she wasn't dead, but that was just sleeping, and that brought scorn and ridicule from the crowd of mourners. Jesus might have done that to downplay the miracle, or he might have just been making a spiritual point that death is just sleep and not permanent. But then there will be a resurrection. That's a good news for us, right? Only 5 people, though, were allowed to accompany Jesus to witness the miracle. Jesus took him with the inner 3, Peter, James, and John, and Jairus and his wife. 3 witnesses were required by law to establish something as a fact. Peter, James, and John were also the 3 who witnessed the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain and witnessed Jesus' private prayer time in the Garden of Gethsemane. Then, without any theatrics, Jesus took the girl's hand and said, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk. So on the second, and that little girl was a corpse, pale and lifeless, and then the next second, a live girl walking around ready for a good meal. The grief Jesus and his wife, Jairus and his wife, instantly gave way to joy and praise. Mark says, at this they were utterly astounded. Who was astounded? Jairus and his wife were astounded. And so were Peter, James, and John. No one had ever seen anything like this. Jesus had immense and unlimited power, not just to heal, but to raise the dead. Jesus told him not to tell anyone, but to give her something to eat. I'm sure these 5 people were eager to tell someone, but Jesus needed to control the speed of growth of his messianic expectations and slow the growth of his opposition. Jairus' daughter had likely not eaten in a long time because of her sickness with so great a compassion and essential practicality. Jesus said, "Give her a burger and fries." So what does God want us to learn from this section to Mark's gospel? God wants us to understand who Jesus is and to put our faith in him. In this section on the miracles of Jesus, we get a bigger and better picture of Jesus' power to bring restoration and healing. We see his power over nature, his ability to calm the storm. We see his power over a legion of demons, which results in the healing of a broken man who was made whole again. We see his power over disease, which results in the healing of a woman's body, and his restoration of the health and community. And then most dramatically, we see his power over death, which results in the restoration of life of a little girl. This, of course, is a preview of Jesus' coming victory that includes his sacrifice on the cross and his resurrection from the tomb. Ultimately, God wants us to conclude that Jesus is worthy of our faith, and we should put all of our trust in Jesus. Jairus and the woman with the issue of the blood, and both had enough faith to seek Jesus and for what they needed, and what they both were rewarded with their faith. The faith of these 2 people stands in stark contrast to the episodes in Mark on either side of them. The episodes before show the failure of the disciples to believe in the midst of the storm and people's rejection of Jesus after the healing of the demonic and death of the pigs. And in the next episode, we'll explore in our next sermon, Jesus will face the rejection of his own people in his own hometown of Nazareth. But here in the middle, we see the desperate faith of two people who trusted in Jesus and were blessed by doing so. When we put our faith in Jesus, it doesn't mean that God will always rescue us from every danger or heal every sickness. But it does mean that we trust in a God who holds the ultimate authority over everything. And for that reason, we need not fear anything. Paul Brown used to refer to my wife as the miracle woman in our congregation because of so many heart procedures and what have you that she overcame for 27 years of heart disease. But she always had a catchphrase. I'm in a win-win situation. If the doctors heal me, I win. I get to spend more time with my family. If I die, I win because I get to go to see Jesus. Win-win. Paul puts it another way in Romans 8:37. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Jesus is our only hope here and for eternity. Whatever or whoever Jesus touches is blessed and changed. Nevertheless, believing in Jesus doesn't make us immune to the normal parts of life and death or the pain and suffering that comes from the persecution of our faith. But by faith, we look forward to the time when God will usher us in to the new heaven and the new earth, where we will be with God forever. And he will wipe away every tear, and death will be no more. And grief, crying, and pain will be gone forever. But in the meantime, we still put our faith in Jesus, who has the power to do anything. And we must continue to live, even if he does not, kind of faith. The faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had. They believed that God could rescue them from the blazing furnace, but even if God didn't, they were still going to trust and obey God. God is pleased with our desperate faith and says we will trust in God that no matter what, even if God doesn't heal our diseases, or keep our loved ones from death, or keep us from persecution, or keep us from losing our job, or bring success or prosperity. Let us trust in God's sovereignty and God's faithful provisions and plans. You know, like the old song, "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus." I hope you're trusting in Jesus all the time, and of all the times of desperation and times of plenty. I hope you're trusting in Jesus alone for salvation, for as Peter declared in Acts 4:12, when Peter saw this, he addressed the people, "Fellow Israelites, why are you amazed at this? Why do you stare at us as though we had made him walk on our own power or godliness?" Whatever you need this morning, will you come as we stand and sing Song of Invitation?